She had been told to expect cruelty. It was a promise made by her officers, a truth etched into the national soul. A young Japanese nurse, barely out of her teens, sat on a rough-hewn wooden bench inside a makeshift medical station. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of blood, the sharp sting of disinfectant, and the damp, earthy smell of the canvas tent. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, her sleeve stained a dark, rusty brown. Across from her, an American medic, a man she had been trained to see as a demon, bent carefully over her arm. He was winding a clean white bandage with a slow, deliberate care that was utterly unnerving. His hands were steady, his voice a low murmur, as if he were tending to his own younger sister. She could not decipher the English words, but the tone needed no translation. There was no hatred in it, no gloating triumph. There was only gentleness, an emotion so alien in this context, it felt like a weapon. For years, she had been fed a steady diet of horror stories. Capture, they said, was a fate worse than death itself. Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai, had trickled down through the centuries, embedding itself into the DNA of the modern soldier and even the auxiliaries who served them. To surrender was the ultimate stain, a betrayal that would dishonor one's family, one's ancestors, and the divine emperor. The shame was supposed to be a fire that consumed you from within. She had whispered the oath herself during training, her voice trembling with conviction. Better to die than be taken. Every woman here had. They believed surrender would lead to ritual humiliation, to starvation that gnawed your bones, to tortures so inventive and cruel that death would become a longed-for mercy. That was the promise. But the reality was, this tent, and the smell of coffee and baking bread that drifted from somewhere nearby. The myth, so carefully constructed, was beginning to tear at the seams. All around her, other captured women sat with steaming bowls of stew, their eyes wide with a mixture of hunger and disbelief. They ate with a quiet desperation, consuming more in a single meal than they had seen in weeks. Some had been given new uniforms, washed and folded. It was not paradise, not yet. It was a profound and terrifying confusion. When the American soldiers had first approached their position, she had braced herself for the crushing impact of a rifle butt, for the sound of mocking laughter, for the leering gaze of a victor claiming his prize. Instead, one had offered her a cigarette, his gesture awkward. Another had silently handed her a canteen of water. When this medic finally touched her arm to examine the shrapnel wound, she flinched violently, a gasp escaping her lips. But he only paused, a frown creasing his brow, before nodding and methodically beginning his work. She found herself staring at the bandage, a pristine white stripe against her bruised and dirt-stained skin. Was it a trick? A prelude to some more elaborate cruelty? The war she had just left had no room for such moments. In the jungles of the Pacific, she had witnessed her own soldiers abandoned by their units, left to bleed out on the trail because they were too weak to keep marching. She had seen daily rations dwindle to a few slivers of rice, sometimes stretched with tree bark or sawdust, to create the illusion of a meal. She had seen officers strike their own men across the face for faltering under the weight of exhaustion. This was discipline, they were told. This was the currency of loyalty. Mercy was a sickness, a weakness to be purged. That was the world she knew. Now, in this tent, that world was beginning to feel like a distant dream. Beside her, an older woman, a veteran of the Manchurian campaign, openly wept as she scraped the last remnants of stew from her bowl. To cry over a meal might seem absurd, but the food was more than just sustenance. It was proof. It was undeniable evidence that the enemy, these supposed monsters, saw them not as objects, but as human beings. The bandage on the young nurse's arm felt tight, but it was the knot of confusion in her stomach that truly constricted her. She looked from the medic's focused expression to the weeping woman, and for the first time, a dangerous question began to form in the back of her mind. If this was a lie, what else was? The bandage was not just cloth and gauze. It was a thread, and with a gentle tug, it was beginning to unravel everything she had ever believed. The first morning in the camp felt like waking up in another dimension. The women were roused not by the familiar shriek of a whistle or the clatter of boots on a packed earth floor, but by the faint, unbelievable smell of frying bacon. The air was cool, the light filtering softly through the slats in the wooden walls of the barrack. For a long moment, they lay still, a collective, silent paralysis, each woman convinced it was some cruel trick of a hungry mind. Then came the call for breakfast, not a barked command but a voice of steady routine. They shuffled into line, their movements uncertain, their eyes darting about as if expecting the illusion to shatter at any moment. Instead, they were handed metal trays laden with scrambled eggs, thick slices of bread, and steaming mugs of coffee. Some women simply stared, their hands frozen at their sides. One whispered that it must be a test of their resolve, or perhaps the food was poisoned. But then they watched the American guards sit down with their own plates, eating the same meal without a second thought, and the first hairline cracks appeared in their wall of suspicion. The young nurse lifted her fork with trembling fingers. The gnawing hunger in her bones had become a constant companion, a dull ache she had almost forgotten was there. With the first bite, a jolt went through her. The richness of the yolk on her tongue, the impossible softness of the bread. The sensations were so potent, so unfamiliar, they were almost violent. Tears stung her eyes. Around her, others devoured the food, with a quiet, desperate intensity, their ingrained dignity battling their screaming hunger. One woman let out a sudden, sharp laugh, a sound edged with hysteria, and immediately covered her mouth in shame. Yet no guard shouted. No punishment was delivered. A few of them only glanced over with mild curiosity, as if laughter, even here, was a permissible human act. The beds themselves were a revelation. Simple wooden frames, thin mattresses, and real wool blankets. After months of sleeping on dirt floors or prickly bamboo mats, the simple act of lying down on something soft felt decadent, almost indecent, as if comfort itself were a form of betrayal. The nurse sat on the edge of her cot, gripping the coarse wool of the blanket. For the first time since leaving home, she had an object that was hers alone, something meant purely for her warmth and comfort. That blanket became more than just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol, not just of warmth, but of worth. The camp was no luxury resort. Barbed wire still coiled along its borders like thorny vines, a constant reminder of their status. Guards still stood watch, with rifles slung over their shoulders. Yet the atmosphere pulsed with a strange contradiction, captivity laced with an inexplicable kindness. The irony was a physical thing, thick enough to taste. While these women adjusted to 3 meals a day, their own families, back in Japan, were surviving on rations so meager that children chewed on tree bark to dull the ache in their stomachs. Allied reports would later estimate that the average Japanese civilian consumed fewer than 1,200 calories daily in the final year of the war. Meanwhile, in these American camps, prisoners were gaining weight, the hollows in their cheeks filling out, their bodies slowly regaining strength. The paradox was grotesque. Captivity was offering more life than freedom had. At first, many recoiled from these comforts, clinging to the ideology that to accept them was to accept dishonor. Some ate with rigid formality, refusing to show gratitude. Others tucked pieces of bread into their pockets, convinced this sudden abundance would end as abruptly as it began. But over time, survival began to erode ideology. A stomach full of eggs has more persuasive power than 1,000 patriotic slogans. The nurse found that each night, as she pulled the blanket up to her chin, the voice in her head that whispered of shame grew a little quieter. In its place rose another, more tentative whisper, "Maybe I am worth this." Yet the dissonance was a constant hum beneath the surface. How could these enemies, these foreign devils, treat them better than their own officers had. How could strangers care about wounds that their comrades had ignored? One woman, once beaten by her superior for collapsing from a fever, stared at her own arm, where an American doctor had carefully administered medicine. Her silence was a question louder than any scream. The days in captivity began to unspool with a rhythm that was both steady and profoundly disarming. The barbed wire was always there, a sharp-toothed line against the sky, but within its perimeter, a subtler campaign was being waged. It was not a battle for territory, but for the mind. It was a slow, quiet revolution of dignity, fought not with bullets, but with chalk, medicine, and choice. The young nurse found herself in a makeshift classroom one afternoon, a stub of white chalk pressed into her hand. Before her, a blackboard bore English letters, carefully printed by a guard who, in another life, had been a schoolteacher in Ohio. She hesitated, her training screaming at her that this was a form of indoctrination. But curiosity was a stronger force. She copied the guard's writing, her own hand tracing a shaky, uncertain attempt at the word HOME. The guard nodded with a simple, encouraging smile. That small gesture carried a weight she could not articulate. Education in her world had been about service, about sharpening oneself into a more effective tool for the empire. Here, learning was offered as a gift, as if her mind mattered beyond its immediate usefulness. The word on the board shimmered before her. What did home even mean now? Was it the rubble-strewn city she had left? Or was it a feeling she was only just beginning to rediscover here? Medicine became another battlefield of perception. One older woman, who had been plagued by a throbbing toothache for months, was led to a camp dentist. The chair was cold, the overhead lamp harsh, but when the American doctor leaned over and spoke softly, explaining the procedure through a translator, she realized with a jolt that he intended to ease her pain, not just ignore it. Back in her unit, such a complaint would have been met with a slap or scorn for her weakness. Moments later, the rotten tooth was gone. She touched her jaw in disbelief. The absence of pain, a ghost in her mouth. The act was not just medical, it was radical. It declared that her individual suffering was not inevitable. It was something that could, and should, be answered with compassion. Choice itself was a foreign language they were all slowly learning to speak. In the afternoons, work assignments were offered, but they were voluntary, not forced. Some chose to help in the kitchens, marveling as they learned to bake bread with yeast, a process alien to their rice flour traditions. Others swept the grounds or tended to small garden plots. One day, a guard handed the nurse a small paper packet of seeds. When she looked at him with confusion, he simply gestured toward a patch of bare earth and said something she did not understand, but the meaning was clear. Grow something. To a woman trained to patch wounds and administer morphine, the idea of coaxing life from soil felt impossibly gentle. Her fingers trembled as she held the packet, not with fear, but with a strange, budding excitement. Even faith found unexpected sanctuary. A few of the women quietly assembled a small Shinto shrine in a corner of the barracks, using stones and scraps of wood. They built it with the constant fear that it would be torn down as a symbol of their defeated culture. Yet, when an American officer saw it, he simply paused, nodded respectfully, and walked on. The unspoken permission was staggering. To practice devotion without scrutiny felt like taking a full breath after years spent underwater. The empire had demanded their worship. The Americans simply allowed it. The letters home became a culmination of this awakening. At first, the nurse struggled, her words stilted and cautious. How could she confess that she was well-fed while her family starved, that an enemy doctor had treated her with more care than her own commanding officer? She settled on simple, undeniable truths. The food is warm, the beds are clean, I am alive. When whispers later circulated that these letters were being intercepted and read by Japanese officials in Tokyo, she wondered what those men thought as they held her words. Did they recognize the sound of their grand narrative cracking under the weight of a simple, honest sentence? These letters, written by hundreds of women, were not just messages to family. They were testimonies, quiet but powerful counter-propaganda that spoke of a reality their government had tried so desperately to deny. The revolution was not loud. It did not come with cannons or shouted slogans, but in the quiet spaces between meals, in hushed confessions shared in the dark. With every kindness, a blow landed against the wall of their indoctrination, and that wall was beginning to crumble. The nurse noticed she no longer hunched with shame when a guard passed. She began to meet their eyes, cautiously at first, acknowledging a shared humanity that crossed the chasm of war. Another woman, who had once hidden her food, now ate openly, the fear that it would be snatched away finally receding. These were small changes, almost invisible, but together they formed something monumental, the rebirth of the self. Still, shame was a persistent ghost. At night, women whispered that they could never face their families again, that to be a survivor of surrender was a stain no kindness could wash away. For one, the burden of this dishonor became too heavy to bear. She was found one evening near the fence, her face a mask of despair, ready to end a life she believed was already forfeit. Yet it was another prisoner who stopped her, gripping her hands with a fierce strength. "They value our lives," she whispered urgently. "If the enemy sees our worth, why can't we?" That question hung in the barracks long after, a radical and impossible idea. It was the seed of a profound transformation. What was honor if it demanded your annihilation? What was loyalty if it fed you lies while your enemy fed you bread? The Americans, perhaps unknowingly, were wielding kindness as a weapon more potent than any rifle. It did not break bones. It broke ideologies. Intelligence flowed more freely from lips that had not been split by torture, offered by those who felt a strange and confusing debt. But something deeper was at work. These women were not merely cooperating, they were awakening. There were moments of unexpected humor that chipped away at the solemnity. The first time the women were offered peanut butter, a wave of confusion rippled through them. One dipped a cautious finger into the thick, brown paste, sniffed it suspiciously, and licked. Her face twisted in a mask of betrayal as she spat it onto the ground, sparking a ripple of laughter from the guards. Another tried, then another, their reactions a mix of disgust and bemusement. Eventually, even the nurse found herself smiling at the strange, sticky sweetness. In that shared laughter, a deep crack formed in the wall of fear. The Americans were not tormentors. They were just people. People who ate strange food. One evening, the camp doctor called the nurse over. He had noticed her squinting for weeks. After a brief examination, he handed her a pair of spectacles, newly fitted. She slipped them on, and the world, which had been a soft blur of shapes and colors, snapped into sharp, breathtaking focus. The lines of the wooden barracks, the leaves on a distant tree, the tired kindness in the doctor's own eyes. She blinked back tears as he said, his words translated simply, "No one should have to live in a blur." She understood. He was talking about more than her eyesight. He was talking about clarity. For the first time, she saw not just the world around her, but herself. She was not just auxiliary nurse Tanaka, a cog in the imperial war machine. She was a woman who liked the taste of coffee and the feel of a warm blanket. A woman whose vision had been clouded in more ways than one. That night, she lay on her cot, clutching its edge, remembering the oath she had once sworn with such fervor, better to die than surrender. Now, she lay alive, warm and clear-eyed, tangled in an impossible question. Had she betrayed her country, or had her country betrayed her? The uncertainty was the true wound, deeper than any shrapnel, and far, far harder to heal. The war ended not with the thunder of a final, glorious battle, but with an unnerving silence. When the announcement finally trickled into the camp, broadcast over a crackling radio, the women did not cheer. They sat stunned, staring at the dusty ground, their minds unable to bridge the gap between this quiet moment and the earth-shattering news. Japan had surrendered. The divine emperor, for whom they had been prepared to die, had bowed his head. The barbed wire that framed their view did not vanish, but its meaning shifted instantly. It no longer marked them as prisoners in an ongoing conflict. It marked them as survivors of a finished one, witnesses to the end of an era. Repatriation began slowly, a vast and clumsy logistical puzzle. The young nurse eventually found herself boarding a transport ship bound for Yokohama, clutching a small bundle of belongings, the wool blanket, the life-altering spectacles, and the ink-stained letter she had once written to her mother. The sea stretched before her, gray and indifferent, and with every nautical mile a cold dread grew in her stomach. What awaited her on the other side? Would she be welcomed as a prodigal daughter, a survivor, or would she be shunned as a traitor? Her very existence, a symbol of the nation's ultimate shame, the kindness she had known in captivity, felt like a fragile, secret thing, a dream that would surely dissolve the moment she set foot back on Japanese soil. The Japan she returned to was a ghost of the one she had left. Yokohama's port was a twisted skeleton of steel and concrete. The cities were vast, sprawling cemeteries of rubble, punctuated by the solitary chimneys of incinerated homes. A fine gray ash seemed to coat everything, and the air smelled of ruin and damp decay. People shuffled through the streets, their faces hollowed out by hunger, their eyes vacant. Her own home was gone, replaced by a patch of scorched earth. She found her mother living with relatives, a woman so thin and frail she seemed almost translucent. The reunion was a choked, tearless embrace, a collision of relief and profound sorrow. In this new, grim reality, her memories of the camp became dangerous, almost obscene. How could she speak of hot meals and full stomachs to a mother who boiled weeds for soup? How could she describe the clean sheets of her cot to a family huddled together for warmth in a single unheated room? To speak of such things felt like a betrayal far greater than surrender. The contrast was a physical ache in her chest. Captivity had offered more humanity than freedom ever had. Other returned women shared her silent burden. They spoke of it only to each other, in hushed whispers in the shadows of ration lines. They spoke of American guards who had learned their names, of nights filled with the clumsy notes of a harmonica, of the shocking, simple dignity of being treated as an individual rather than a tool of the state. Their stories were fragments of a world that no longer existed, a truth that had no place in the grand narrative of noble sacrifice and devastating defeat. For many, their families viewed them with a quiet suspicion. They had lived while so many others had died. Their survival was an uncomfortable question. One afternoon, months after her return, the nurse sat with her mother over a meager meal. The silence between them had become a chasm. Finally, her mother asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the thin broth in her bowl. "What was it like there?" The nurse hesitated. The truth, a heavy stone in her throat. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She described the eggs, the bread, the beds. She spoke of the spectacles placed on her nose by an American doctor, of the stunning moment she could see the world clearly for the first time in years. Her mother began to weep, quiet, racking sobs. The nurse braced herself for words of shame, of disappointment, but instead, her mother looked at her, her eyes shining with tears, and whispered, At least someone remembered you were human." The irony was unbearable. The empire had promised glory and delivered ashes. The enemy had promised nothing and had, in the end, delivered their humanity back to them. It was as if the entire world had been flipped upside down. The women who lived through this paradox would never see the world the same way again. They were strangers in their own land, guardians of a memory that was both a comfort and a curse. The story of these women does not end at the barbed wire fence or on the shores of their ruined homeland. It lingers in the quiet aftermath, In the subtle ways their paradoxical experience rippled through a nation struggling to rebuild itself. For some, the transformation was overt. They became advocates for peace, their voices small but insistent in a society grappling with its own reflection. They spoke not with anger, but with the quiet authority of those who had seen the face of the enemy and found humanity there. Others carried their memories silently, letting them shape the way they raised their children, teaching them that compassion could be a greater strength than cruelty, that a shared meal could be more powerful than a shared ideology. Decades later, when historians and journalists sought them out, their testimonies still hummed with the original shock. One elderly woman, her hands folded in her lap, recalled a simple piece of chocolate. "They gave it to me, and I did not believe it was real," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "I thought it must be a trick. But then I saw the guard eat the same piece. That moment changed me. If the enemy could share chocolate, what else could the world share?" Another woman, who became a translator, confessed, "I learned English in the camp. I still speak it. Sometimes, I still dream in it." From a strategic perspective, the American policy of humane treatment was an undeniable success. Military intelligence officers later admitted that the approach reaped rewards far beyond expectations. Cooperation flowed naturally from prisoners who felt respected, not brutalized. Vital information was sometimes shared not out of fear, but from a strange, complicated sense of gratitude. Some historians have argued that the whispers of this treatment, carried back by the wind of rumor, may have subtly eroded the will to fight to the last man, potentially shortening the war by months and saving countless lives. But the Americans, for all their pragmatism, likely never intended to spark a spiritual revolution. Their policies were rooted in the obligations of the Geneva Convention and the cold logic of war. Yet the unintended consequence was a revelation for those who lived it. For the women themselves, the real legacy was not strategic. It was profoundly personal. They had been sent out to serve an empire that promised glory but delivered starvation. In captivity, they had glimpsed a world where dignity was not a reward for suffering, but a birthright given freely. The empire's code had demanded death before dishonor. Their captors had shown them that a life preserved with dignity was a far more powerful force. The nurse, who had once believed her only worth was in her utility to the emperor, now knew otherwise. She had been valued by strangers. Her pain had mattered. Her hunger deserved relief. Her vision deserved clarity. That knowledge was indelible. It could not be untaught or erased. The simple objects she carried home, the spectacles, the blanket, the letter, became symbols of a truth larger than any war. In the end, the greatest shock was not that the Americans had treated them kindly. It was that kindness itself could survive in a world so completely devoted to destruction. It was the discovery that dignity could bloom behind barbed wire, that an enemy could be the one to remind you of your own humanity. And as the story of this strange, paradoxical paradise spread, first through families, then through villages, and finally across oceans, it carried with it a question that unsettled both victors and vanquished alike. If paradise could exist inside a prison, what did that say about the world we had built outside?